A note before we begin. What follows is a work of fiction, but it is fiction built from the testimony of real people. Between 1994 and 1998, a famine swept through North Korea that the government called the Arduous March. The words famine and hunger were banned by the state. Citizens were instructed not to use them. What was happening to them did not have a permitted name. Estimates of the dead range from 600,000 to over 2 million. In a country of 22 million people, that is between 3 and 10% of the entire population. Gone in 4 years. Defectors who crossed into China and eventually reached South Korea, described in testimony collected by human rights organizations, journalists, and the United Nations. Things that had happened. Things they had seen. Things they could not unsee. Among these testimonies across multiple independent sources were accounts of cannibalism, not rumor, documented, cross-referenced, reported in the state's own execution records, which listed men prosecuted and killed for it. One defector speaking to the Washington Post said, "I cannot condemn it. Not that I wanted to eat human meat, but we were so hungry." The story told here is about what it does to a person to witness something they cannot name, in a country that has banned the names of its worst realities. It is about a woman named Su Yan, who was 14 years old in 1997, and what she saw at the market in her town, and what she has carried since then. She is not real, but she is made of real people. Please listen carefully. Su Yan learned to read the dead before she learned to read a clock. This is not a metaphor. In Chongjin, in the north of North Korea, in the winter of 1997, this was simply a skill that a 14-year-old developed out of necessity. You learned to tell the difference between someone sleeping on the ground and someone who had stopped sleeping permanently. You learned it by the color, a particular gray-blue that skin acquired, and by the stillness, which was different from sleep's stillness, in a way she could not explain to anyone who had not seen it. Sleep had a quality of maintenance to it. The other kind did not. She had been reading the dead since she was 12. Her family was 4 people: her mother, her younger brother Junho, her grandmother, and herself. Her father had worked at the steel mill, and the steel mill had been running at perhaps 20% capacity for 2 years when the public distribution system, the state apparatus through which every North Korean family received their food allocation, collapsed entirely in 1995. The ration had been declining for years before that. 300 grams of grain per person per day, then 200, then 100, then for months at a stretch, nothing. Her father died in February 1996. Su Yan's mother told the children he had died of a cold that had gone to his chest. Su Yan was 13 and she understood this was true and also not the whole truth. He had died of a cold that a well-fed body would have survived without difficulty. He had died of a cold that moved into a chest that had no reserves left to fight it with. They moved the body to the street in the morning, the way you did. The truck came in the afternoons and collected what had accumulated through the night and the morning. Su Yan did not watch it leave. By 1997, the 4 of them, mother, grandmother, Junho, Su Yan, were surviving on a combination of things that did not, in normal times, constitute food. Corn husks boiled into a kind of paste, grass from the field behind the housing block dried and ground, tree bark stripped and soaked until it was soft enough to swallow. Her grandmother, in the precise and unsentimental way of someone who had survived worse decades and drawn practical conclusions from them, had a technique for extracting the inner layer of pine bark that provided something close to sustenance. She taught it to Su-yeon without ceremony, the way you teach someone to tie a knot. Junho was 9. He was the size of a child half his age. He had the specific alert leanness of a child whose body has been burning everything available for so long that it has begun to look for things that are not available. His eyes were very large in a face that had become mostly cheekbone. Su-yeon thought about food the way she had once thought about school, constantly, in layers, planning and replanning. She thought about the market. The Jangmadang, the informal black markets that had sprung up across North Korea as the state system collapsed. And what might be there today, and what could be traded for what, and whether the woman 2 blocks over who had a contact in the countryside had received anything this week. The market was where she went every morning. The market was where it happened. There was a warning that circulated among the women who worked the market stalls in Chongjin in the winter of 1997. It passed between them in the specific way that information passed in North Korea. Quietly, indirectly, framed as something other than what it was passed the way you pass a match in the dark, carefully, quickly, with full awareness of what it could ignite. The warning was this: don't buy meat from a seller you don't know. It was phrased with the careful vagueness of a country that had banned the names of its problems. Don't ask where it came from. Don't buy it if the price is too good and the seller won't meet your eyes. Just don't. Su-yeon heard the warning from her mother, who had heard it from a neighbor, who had heard it from a woman at the market, whose sister was a nurse and knew things that nurses in Chongjin in 1997 knew and wished they didn't. She heard it and filed it alongside the other survival knowledge she had accumulated. The bark technique, the color of the dead, the right time of day to look for discarded food near the housing block for party officials, which was always the best block and always the most dangerous to be near. She went to the market that morning as she did every morning. The market was held in the open ground behind the train station, a space that had, before the famine, been a park where she had played as a small child. Now it was rows of people with things spread on blankets or held in their hands, offering them to anyone who had something to trade. The state had not sanctioned the Jangmadang. It existed in the illegal space that hunger had carved out of the ideology, the gap between what the country said was happening and what was actually happening. Vendors could be arrested. Sometimes they were. They came back the next day because the alternative was to stop eating. Su-yeon was looking for corn. Just corn. Unprocessed, whole kernels, the kind you could boil for an hour and produce something that was almost a meal. She had a small piece of cloth her mother had cut from a coat, which could be traded. She was moving through the market when she saw the vendor. He was a man she did not recognize, which was itself notable. After 2 years of this market, she knew most of the faces, the way any regular knows the faces of a place. He was perhaps 50, thin in the universal way of 1997 Chongjin, wearing the padded jacket that was everyone's winter uniform. In front of him on a piece of plastic sheeting was meat. Real meat. A quantity of it that was immediately, visibly wrong. In 1997 in Chongjin, meat at the Jangmadang was almost never real meat. It was sometimes dog, if someone had been desperate enough to kill what was often also hungry, and therefore also not much. It was sometimes rat. It was sometimes things that took on the texture of meat through extensive cooking. It was not ever this amount of what appeared to be actual flesh, pinkish and dense and simply present, in a way that the market did not produce from any known source. Several women had gathered at a distance from the vendor and were not buying. They were looking at the meat and not buying and not moving on, standing in the particular way of people who have registered something wrong but have no sanctioned vocabulary for what exactly the wrongness is. The vendor met Soo-yeon's eyes across the distance. She looked away immediately and walked to the other side of the market and did not look back. She did not find corn. She went home with nothing. She did not tell her mother what she had seen. There was no version of it she could tell. The warning had been, "Don't buy meat from someone you don't know." She had not bought meat. She had seen what there was to see, and she had walked away. That was all. That was everything. She told herself in the weeks and months that followed that she didn't know, that she couldn't be certain, that the market produced strangenesses in those years, and not every strangeness had the worst explanation. She told herself this for a long time. She mostly believed it. Her brother Junho died in March 1997. Not violently, not dramatically. He simply became too weak to maintain the basic functions that bodies require, and then he stopped maintaining them. And then he was the color she had learned to recognize, and she knew without needing to confirm it. She sat with him for a long time in the room before she told her mother. She did not know why. She sat with him and looked at his face, which had been her brother's face for 9 years, and thought about the fact that he had never once in his life, as far as she could remember, had enough to eat. This is the thought that stayed, not the grief which came later and differently. This specific thought that the entirety of his life had been colored by hunger. He had been born into a country that could not feed him, and he had lived 9 years in that country, and then he had died of it. He had never known what it felt like to be full. Her grandmother died 6 weeks later. Her mother, who was 36 years old and had the body of a woman of 60, did not die. She survived with the specific grim tenacity of mothers who have decided at some cellular level that they are not permitted to die as long as there is still one child who needs them. Soo-yeon was the child. She was the reason her mother survived, and she understood this, and it was a weight she carried alongside everything else. The daily survival, the market, the bark technique her grandmother had taught her, and which she now performed alone. The market continued. In the spring and summer of 1997, there were some months where things slightly improved. Less cold, some foraged greens, the fields producing something small when people were desperate enough to plant the narrow strips of land that the state hadn't yet requisitioned. Soo-yeon continued to go every morning. She did not see the vendor again. She did not know if this meant anything or nothing. People appeared and disappeared in the market, the way they appeared and disappeared everywhere in Chongjin in 1997. But she began in those months to have a dream. Always the same dream. She was in the market and the vendor was there, and she was standing at a distance looking at the meat on the plastic sheeting, and in the dream she knew, with the absolute certainty that only dreams provide, exactly what it was and exactly whose it had been. She knew a name. The name was never a name she knew waking, never someone she could identify. But in the dream she always knew, and she stood in the market and she looked at the meat and she thought, I should say your name. Someone should say your name. And she could not. In the dream, as in the waking world, there was no permitted language for it. There was no word for what had happened that could be said in that place at that time. The country had banned the names of its worst realities, and the worst reality of all had no name to give back to the person it had taken. She would wake from this dream and lie in the dark and not cry, because by late 1997, she had used up the particular resource that crying required, and simply think, I don't know your name. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. She crossed the Tumen River into China in January 1998. She was 15 years old. Her mother crossed with her, holding her arm on the ice in the way that her mother had held her arm her entire life. Practical, firm, the grip of someone who is not going to let go. The crossing was made at night, in the coldest part of winter when the ice was solid and the border guards were fewer and the darkness was a resource that cost nothing, and they used everything that cost nothing. China was overwhelming. She had been told China was impoverished, that it was less developed than North Korea, that the dear leader's workers lived better than the citizens of any capitalist country. The first Chinese village she walked into had more food visible in a single market stall than she had seen in a year. She stood in front of a display of vegetables and felt something happen in her chest that was not quite emotion and not quite physical sensation, but somewhere between the two. A kind of reckoning, the body understanding something that the mind had been protecting itself from understanding for 3 years. She and her mother were passed between churches and underground networks and sympathetic Korean-Chinese families, slowly over months until they eventually reached South Korea in 1999 through an underground route she was instructed to never describe in detail and has never described in detail. In Seoul, there were interviews, organizations that collected testimony that needed to understand what had happened inside the country that shared a border and a language and nothing else with the country she now lived in. She told them about her father, about Junho, about her grandmother, about the bark technique in the market and the color of the dead. She did not tell them about the vendor. She was asked carefully by one interviewer, a woman about her mother's age, who had a gentle voice and a legal pad, and who paused before the question whether she had seen or heard anything at the markets regarding the things that some other defectors had reported. The interviewer did not say the word directly, the way the country of her birth had not permitted her to say the word. The interviewer simply paused and gestured with the careful vagueness of someone trying not to contaminate a witness's account with leading language. Soo-yeon said, "I saw a vendor I didn't recognize selling more meat than the market could produce from any source I knew. I did not buy it. I walked away." The interviewer wrote this down. Soo-yeon said, "I didn't know his name, and I didn't know the name of... I didn't know. I still don't know." The interviewer set down her pen. She said, "I understand." Soo-yeon said, "I don't think you do. I don't mean that unkindly. I mean that the thing I couldn't do there was say someone's name, give someone's name back to them. And I still can't because I never knew it. And that is what I carry, not the other thing, the name I couldn't say." The interviewer was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You can say it here, whatever name you would have given them, if you could. You can say it here." Soo-yeon thought about the dream, the market, the meat, the certain knowledge of a name that was never the same name twice and always felt in the dream like the right one. She said a name, a common name, one that could have belonged to anyone, to a man or a woman, to someone from Chongjin or somewhere else entirely, to someone who had needed to be seen and had not been seen, whose worst moment had become someone else's worst thing witnessed. The interviewer wrote it down. She dated the entry. She closed the legal pad. She said, "It has been recorded. Someone knows now." Soo-yeon is in her 40s now. She lives in Seoul. She has a job and an apartment and a daughter who is 12 years old and has never once been hungry in a way that mattered. Her mother is still alive, small and fierce, living in the same apartment building 2 floors down. She does not often speak about Chongjin. This is not avoidance. It is the practical rationing of something that costs her each time she spends it. She speaks about it when it will be useful, when testimony will do something, when there is a reason beyond the hearing itself. But she speaks about Junho often, to her daughter who has her grandmother's eyes and her uncle's habit of going very still and very attentive when something interests her. She speaks about him with the specific kind of love that has no bitterness in it. The love that has had 25 years to settle into something clear, something that has burned off every complication and left only the fact of him, that he existed, that he was 9 years old and very thin and never had enough to eat, and looked at her sometimes in the market mornings with a trust that she has never been able to fully convince herself she deserved, because she survived and he did not. And the logic of who survives a famine is not a logic that rewards what is deserved. She says his name to her daughter regularly. Just that. His name, the year he was born, the year he died, the city. This is who he was. This is what happened. Remember this. And on the anniversary of the date she cannot be entirely certain of. The day she believes, from what she remembers of the cold and the light, was the morning she went to the market and saw what she saw. She says another name, a different name each year, chosen with care, a name that could have belonged to someone. She says it quietly, in the kitchen, alone. She does not know whose name it is. She has decided that this does not matter. The saying of a name matters. The acknowledgement that a person was there and was lost and was not nameless, even if the name you give them is borrowed rather than given. This matters. In a country that banned the language of its worst truths, the most radical act was always the simplest one. To say what happened. To say a name. To say, I was there, I saw you, you were a person, you existed. The famine killed between 600,000 and 2 million people. Most of them do not have names that survived them. Say one. It doesn't matter which. Say one tonight into the dark for someone who never got to cross a river into a place where they could finally eat. They were hungry. They deserved better. Say their name.